This woman threw her 5-year-old son into the well behind her house because a spiritualist told her the boy was the reason she couldn't conceive again. And when the truth came out, she had already let an innocent 18-year-old girl take the blame for it. Let's go back to how it all began. My name is Jennifer. I live in a quiet residential estate on the outskirts of the city, the kind of neighborhood with tall fences, security gates, and neighbors who wave at each other but rarely talk. Hannah and her family lived 2 houses down from mine, in a big duplex with cream-colored walls and a backyard that still had an old water well from before the estate got connected to the city's water supply. Most people had since converted theirs into flower beds or storage sheds, but Hannah's husband, Michael, kept theirs, said it reminded him of his late father's house, and that the water was cleaner than what comes through the pipes anyway. Hannah and I had been neighbors for almost 6 years, and in all that time, we were never close. She had a way of looking at people, at me especially, like we were beneath her. Michael owned a chain of small supermarkets across the city, and their house had the kind of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. My husband and I, on the other hand, ran a modest provision store a few streets away. Hannah made sure, in small ways, that I always felt the difference between us. A tight smile here, an unanswered greeting there. But none of that mattered on the morning everything changed. I had been down with a fever for 3 days, the kind that makes your bones ache and your head feel stuffed with wet cloth. My husband had gone to open the shop, insisting I rest, so I stayed home, drifting in and out of sleep on the couch by the window. The same window that faced Hannah's backyard, where that old well sat, half covered with wooden planks that had started to rot at the edges. It was around mid-morning when I heard crying. Not the soft kind. The kind that claws at your chest. I dragged myself to the window, and that's when I saw little Daniel, Hannah's son, 5 years old, always running around the compound with a toy car missing 2 wheels, standing near the well, sobbing for his mother. And then I saw Hannah. She walked toward him slowly. Too slowly. The kind of slow that didn't match a mother going to comfort her crying child. I almost looked away. I almost convinced myself I was seeing things, that the fever was playing tricks on me. But something, call it instinct, call it the hand of God, made me reach for my phone on the table beside me. I propped it against the window frame and pressed record, telling myself I just wanted to capture Daniel's laughter for Hannah later, something kind, something neighborly, despite how she treated me. What I captured instead was the moment Hannah picked up her son, ignored his screams, walked to the edge of that well, and threw him in. I dropped the phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to run outside, but my body wouldn't move. By the time I found the strength to crawl to the door, Hannah was already wailing, loudly, dramatically, calling out for help, calling out a name. Jane. Jane did this. Jane threw my baby. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell, the ones that show you how far people will go when fear, superstition, and desperation take hold of a human heart. Make sure you're subscribed and have your notifications on, because what happens next to Hannah, to Jane, and to me, will leave you speechless. Now, let's continue. Jane was 18. She had moved to the city 2 years earlier from a small town a few hours away, hoping to save money for nursing school. A distant relative had connected her with Hannah's family, and since then, Jane had lived with them, helping with house chores, running errands, and looking after Daniel whenever Hannah was too busy, which, in that household, was most days. Jane was quiet, polite, and from what I'd seen over the fence many times, she genuinely adored that little boy. She helped him with his alphabet flashcards. She let him drive her around the compound on his broken toy car, pretending to be his passenger even when he steered them straight into the flower pots. Hannah often scolded her for spoiling him, but Jane never stopped. By the time I managed to get myself outside, weak, dizzy, leaning on my gate, several neighbors had already gathered around Hannah's compound, drawn by the screaming. 2 men from across the street were pulling Daniel's small body out of the well. I won't describe what I saw. Some things shouldn't be repeated, even in a story. Hannah was on the ground, screaming, beating her chest, pointing at Jane, who stood frozen by the kitchen door, confusion and terror written all over her young face. "She did it. I saw her. I just came back from the shopping mall and saw her throwing my son into the well," Hannah cried. Jane kept shaking her head, tears streaming down her face. "I was inside, Ma. I was ironing clothes in the laundry room. Madam, I swear, I was inside." Nobody believed her. Why would they? A grieving mother's word against a teenage house helps. Phones came out, not to record evidence, but to film Hannah's grief, to capture the chaos for social media. Someone had already called the police. But in the few minutes before the sirens arrived, the crowd's mood shifted, from shock to something darker. A man grabbed Jane's arm roughly. A woman screamed insults at her, things no 18-year-old should ever have to hear. And I stood there at my gate, fever weak, clutching my phone with the video still on it, and I said nothing. I want to be honest with you, because that's the only way this story means anything. I was afraid. Hannah's family had money, connections, lawyers on retainer for their supermarket business. Michael's stores employed dozens of people across the city, including 2 of my own cousins. If I stood up right there and said, "I have proof," and it wasn't Jane, it was Hannah, what would happen to me? To my husband? To our small shop, which depended on goodwill from people in this estate? So when the police arrived and began asking questions, I quietly stepped back into my house. I told myself someone else would speak up. I told myself the investigators would do their job properly and the truth would surface on its own. I told myself 100 lies that day, and I believed every one of them, because believing them let me close my eyes that night and sleep, or at least try to. 3 weeks passed. Jane was arrested that same evening and taken to the Central Police Station downtown. She was charged with the murder of a 5-year-old boy, a child she had cared for, fed, taught his letters, and pushed around the compound in a broken toy car more times than his own mother ever had. I followed the case the way you watch a fire spread when you're too afraid to grab a bucket of water, from a distance, through the news, through estate WhatsApp groups buzzing with opinions from people who knew nothing. Jane's family, her parents, simple traders from her hometown, came to the city as soon as they heard. They couldn't afford a private lawyer, so a court-appointed defense attorney was assigned to her, a tired-looking man who, from what I heard, barely visited her before each hearing. Witnesses from the estate testified that they'd seen Jane near the well earlier that morning, true, because she sometimes fetched water from it for washing, and the prosecution built much of its case around that single detail. Hannah, meanwhile, played her role perfectly. She wore black to every hearing, sat beside Michael with a handkerchief pressed to her face, and gave a tearful interview to a local TV station, describing how Jane had always seemed distant with Daniel, how she'd sensed something off about that girl for months. Michael stood beside his wife through it all, his face hollow, a man who had lost his only son and now believed the person responsible was finally about to face justice. I watched the news the night the judge set a date for Jane's sentencing, just 2 days away. 2 days before an 18-year-old girl would be sentenced for a crime she didn't commit, a crime that could mean decades behind bars, depending on how the judge ruled on the murder charge. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing Daniel's small hands reaching for his mother. I kept hearing Jane's voice, "I swear, I was inside." And I kept seeing my own reflection in the dark window, the coward who had the truth in her phone for 3 weeks and said nothing. I thought about my husband, our shop, what people in the estate might say, what Hannah's family, with their money and their lawyers, might do to us if I crossed them. And then I thought about a teenage girl alone in a holding cell, waiting to be punished for someone else's sin, while the real killer sat in a courtroom in designer black, collecting sympathy from an entire city. I got up. I found my phone. And this time, I watched the video all the way through, without looking away. Then I called the police hotline and told them I had something they needed to see, that night, before it was too late. The next morning, 2 detectives came to my house. I showed them the video on my phone, then handed it over so their tech team could verify it hadn't been edited. I told them everything, how I'd been sick that day, how I'd seen it happen from my window, how fear had kept me silent for 3 weeks. I expected them to be angry with me, and honestly, I deserved it. But the senior detective just watched the footage twice, looked at me, and said quietly, "This changes everything. We need to move fast, sentencing is tomorrow." By that afternoon, a team had arrived at Hannah's house with a warrant. I watched from my window, the same window, as officers led her out in handcuffs, past the neighbors who had cheered her on weeks earlier. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face was blank, almost confused, like she still couldn't understand why anyone would question her story. It was during questioning at the station that the rest came out. Hannah confessed. Not right away, but eventually, once the detectives showed her the footage, frame by frame, and denial became pointless. She told them about a woman she'd been visiting for months, a self-styled spiritual consultant who ran a private prayer and consultation center in a quiet part of the city, the kind of place that advertised in newspaper classifieds with phrases like solutions to all life's problems, fertility, finances, marriage. Hannah had gone to her after 5 years of trying for another child, 5 years of miscarriages, hospital visits, and whispered comments from Michael's mother about checking on her womb and hinting that Michael might need to consider his options. The consultant told Hannah that Daniel, her own son, was not truly her son. That he was a spirit in the form of a python, wearing the face of a child, sent to block her womb, and that as long as he lived, she would never carry another child to term. The only way to break the covenant, she said, was to return the python to water before his next birthday. Hannah believed her. Completely. The way people believe things when they are desperate enough, ashamed enough, and have spent years being told their worth depends on how many children they can bear. Even in a city full of hospitals and fertility specialists she could have consulted instead. She didn't see a little boy who called her mummy and asked her to fix his broken toy car. She saw an obstacle. A curse. Something to be removed. And when it was done, and the horror of what she'd done began to creep in, not guilt for the act itself, but fear of consequences, she needed someone to blame. Jane was right there. Young, poor, far from home, with no one in the city to fight for her. An easy sacrifice to protect herself a second time. Jane was released less than 24 hours before her scheduled sentencing. I wasn't at the station when it happened, but I heard she collapsed when they told her, repeating, "Is it really over? Is it really over?" Her parents, who had been sleeping outside the courthouse for 2 days because they couldn't afford a hotel, wept openly when they saw her walk out. Later, when they learned my name from the police, they came to find me. I didn't feel like someone who deserved thanks. I kept thinking about those 3 weeks. 3 weeks Jane spent in a cell, terrified, in a city she barely knew, while I lay safely in my bed, weighing my comfort against her freedom. I told her mother that. I told her I was sorry it took me so long. That my silence could have cost her daughter everything, her freedom, her future, maybe her life. Jane's mother held my hands and said something I'll never forget, "You were scared. But in the end, you chose truth over fear." Many people never get there at all. Michael filed for divorce before Hannah's trial even concluded. I heard he sold the house, well and all. Within months, unable to live in a place that held so much horror, unable to face neighbors who now knew exactly what his wife, the mother of his only child, was capable of. He moved across the city, far from our estate, and I never saw him again. Hannah was convicted of murder and of perverting the course of justice for falsely accusing Jane. The court didn't care about spiritual consultants or curses or 5 years of heartbreak. All it saw was a mother who killed her son in cold blood and then tried to send an innocent girl to prison in her place. As for the spiritual consultant, when detectives went looking for her center, it had already been cleared out. Signboard taken down, phone numbers disconnected, the rented space locked up overnight. To this day, no one knows where she went, or how many other desperate women like Hannah she had whispered the same poison to before. I still live in that estate, though Hannah's old house has new owners now, a young couple who filled in the well and built a small gazebo over it. Sometimes, when I pass by on my way to the shop, I think about Daniel's laugh, the way he used to drive Jane around the compound in that broken toy car, shouting vroom, vroom at nothing in particular. And I think about how close the truth came to being buried with him. Not because no one knew it, but because the person who knew it was too afraid to speak. If there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's this: silence doesn't protect anyone. It only buys evil more time to destroy someone else. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And let us know in the comments, what would you have done in Jennifer's position?